Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We will begin our webinar momentarily.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is Jerry Green from the Pacific Council in non-snowy Los Angeles. I'm delighted to welcome you to our event this afternoon. I want to begin by thanking Justin Liu, who actually connected Robert Costa to us. It shows the power of the Notre Dame mafia, I think, that they both are Notre Dame people. But Justin, thank you so much for connecting Mr. Costa to us. I was telling Robert as a longtime Washington Post reader, I'm sorry we're going to lose him to CBS, but he said he'll be engaged in both. So as you can guess, Robert Costa is just accepted a position with CBS News as chief election and campaign correspondent, and that is a high risk profession in these days, and given what's going on. Prior to joining CBS in 2022, which I think was probably a couple of weeks ago, Robert Costa was a longtime national political reporter at the Washington Post, where he has worked since 2014. He previously served as a moderator and managing editor of Washington Week on PBS and as a political analyst for NBC News and MSNBC. He holds a bachelor's degree from Notre Dame, as I mentioned, and a master's from the University of Cambridge. And we're really delighted to welcome you. In conversation with Robert Costa is Leslie Gilbert-Laurie, who is a member of the board of I always put this first as if this is everybody's greatest achievement in life, a member of the Pacific Council on International Policy Board. She has over 30 years of leadership experience in human rights. She serves on the board of Human Rights Watch, social justice, education equity, child advocacy, communications, and really is one of the leading lights of civil society of Los Angeles. She's an attorney, she's an author, she's a philanthropist, she's a former television executive, and really someone who makes LA the very special place that it is. I'm delighted to thank Leslie for interlocuting with Robert Costa. I'm delighted to welcome all of you to this event, and I'm going to fade into the woodwork and turn it over to the experts. So thank you all for joining us. Robert Costa, Leslie Gilbert-Laurie, thank you as well.
Thank you, Jerry, and good afternoon to all of you. I was delighted to be asked to moderate this, or interlocate, I don't know what the verb is, but to moderate this conversation, because this book, Peril, is so well written and it's fascinating. Even for those who feel that they've heard perhaps more than enough about the events around the 2020 election, this book is about our future. So thank you, Robert, for co-authoring Peril and for being here today. Before we jump into my questions and then those from our audience, would you take a few minutes and give us an overview of the book?
Well, it's wonderful to be with you, Leslie, and to be with the Pacific Council. Many thanks to my friend Justin Liu. We served together on a board at the University of Notre Dame. He is a first-class individual, and I'm so glad to be part of this discussion tonight with all of you. Peril is a book. More than a year ago, I never would have expected I would be writing. It was a decision I came to around November of 2020 when Bob Woodward and I decided together to work on a book about the final days of the Trump administration and the beginning of the Biden presidency. We thought we'd probably end up writing a book mostly about Biden. The end of the Trump presidency would maybe have some bumps in the road, but it wouldn't be something that would be historically explosive. That all changed in early January 2021, as we all saw. The Capitol attacked, an insurrection. But what over the course of the next 5 or 6 months after the attack on the Capitol, what was fascinating to me as a reporter is that we found in our reporting and over 6,000 pages of transcripts, doing interviews on deep background with people who were in the room for so many decisions. What we found was that President Trump was coordinating a pressure campaign and pulling all of these different levers of power to try to overturn the election. In fact, President Trump just acknowledged in a statement this week that his intent was to overturn the election. And he said that in a written statement that was issued in criticism of Vice President Mike Pence, whose aides, some of them who feature as characters in our book, are testifying before the House committee investigating January 6th. And so many of the scenes in our book have been cited in subpoena documents by the House committee, which as a reporter, you're proud to see, in a sense, that people on a committee that's very serious are looking at what happened and who was involved in some of these final days decisions. For Woodward, it was a revival of sorts of final days reporting. He and Carl Bernstein so expertly captured the final days of Richard Nixon's presidency in 1974 for their 1976 book, The Final Days. And all these decades later, we were then, once again, as a team, covering a presidency in collapse, and also the beginning of a presidency. And I'd like to get into that a little bit tonight. But for someone who's known Donald Trump for over 10 years, really seeing him at the end was something to witness up close that was deeply troubling. I was outside the Willard Hotel on January 5th, 2021. I had heard Steve Bannon and Rudy Giuliani might be around. And as I approached that famous hotel in Washington, D.C., it was almost gave me a chill, not just because it was freezing cold outside that night in Washington, but because Proud Boys and Oath Keepers were circling the hotel, giving each other high fives, wearing red caps, militia gear. The rest of Washington was empty, but the Willard Hotel, it was a frenzy of activity. And that was the eve of an insurrection I would have never have predicted. I could have seen chaos coming. I called Woodward at around 11 p.m. on January 5th, said it's deeply disturbing down here, what's happening around the White House, these crowds of people who are very animated that the election was a lie and they'd like to see something happen. But even then, I would have not have predicted it. But reporting is everything, and that's why the power and luxury of time for a book makes it so much different than a newspaper report. Because what I first thought, and Woodward thought, was something that was maybe an episode, a spasm of activity. President Trump being slow to act on the day itself, January 6, 2021, really turned out to be a deeper, darker story about a long, weeks-long pressure campaign on Vice President Pence, the Department of Justice, state officials, federal lawmakers. And it was something that we wanted as reporters to not be the one to make conclusions, to not be the one stating opinion, but to let the facts speak for themselves. And as Woodward has shown throughout his career, documents are everything. And we found one document in particular for this project, what we call the Eastman Memo. A California lawyer, conservative John Eastman, wrote a 2-page, 6-part memo that many have called a blueprint for a coup. And this was given to the vice president's team, circulated around the White House. And it essentially said that on January 6th, President Trump wanted Vice President Pence to throw out millions of votes, to discard electors on the certification day. And it would have been a constitutional crisis almost certainly if Pence had walked away from the lectern and you had a sitting president and a sitting vice president decide not to recognize the incoming president. And then you had the attack on the Capitol. And so there's so much to discuss in this book, because for me, it's a snapshot in time, the times we're living in. And I'm happy to have a conversation tonight, both with you, Leslie, and for all of us who are joined here on this conversation.
Terrific, thank you. And there is so much to discuss. I couldn't even have more questions, and I'm sure our audience does too, than we will have time for, but let's cover as much as we can. Your book starts with such a wow scene that then you come back to later in the book as well, when you have General Mark Milley, right, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and he's having secret conversations with his Chinese counterpart, General Lee, 4 days, I think, before the insurrection, and then right after the insurrection as well. And the point was to assure China that the United States is what he says 100% steady, and despite what they might be hearing. And the point was to alleviate China's fears, and that which could lead to an attack. And General Milley says, if we were going to attack you, I assure you all, I would call you first. And then General Lee responds, I'll take you at your word. So after that, which I found, extremely surprising, you report that Speaker Pelosi calls General Milley soon after that, and she wants assurances that President Trump won't set off a nuclear war unilaterally. And General Milley assures her that that would not happen, but he then immediately calls his senior military staff together, right? This is all in this one period of time. And he goes through the protocol. He wants to make sure they're aware of the protocol, and that before anything happened on a nuclear front, that he was brought into the picture. So how surprising was it in real time for you to be reporting this? And what else most surprised you along the way as you were reporting for this book?
We decided to put this reporting in the beginning of the book, not just to make people stand up or sit on the edge of their seat, but to really make a point with the reporting that so much of January 6th and the days around it had previously, before this book came out in September of 2021, been framed as a domestic political crisis. But our reporting shows that, in fact, it was that, but it was also a foreign policy crisis, a national security emergency. And that what happens in the United States is not something, as the Pacific Council knows well, everything that happens here has global ramifications. And President Trump's conduct on January 6th and 7th alarmed the world, adversaries and allies alike, and including China. And the Chinese and the US military have been having a very scattered and sometimes frantic relationship in the South China Sea. And there was a real fear of confusion on the Chinese side, that maybe they would see a weakening American democracy, some kind of leadership coup playing out, and that there could be a confused reaction that would lead to possible military action or at least miscommunication. And as we detail in the book, leaders of the military like Mark Milley, the senior officer, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, believe miscommunication can be the seed for war. So how do you avoid that miscommunication that can plant the seed for possible war? You have to communicate. And it's a moment in history, January 8th, 2021, the head of the Chinese military, General Lee, talking to the head of the US military on a back channel line. Milley has testified under oath about this conversation. But like so much in life, having a prior relationship is important. Milley doesn't talk to Lee out of the blue in a cold way on January 8th. It's a relationship that goes back at least to October 30th and many years prior, where they've had conversations. And Milley's message is, calm down, the United States is fine. But China wasn't the only issue on January 8th, 2021. You had Russia and Iran and other nations that were on high alert about US stability. And when you step back and think about that piece of reporting, it's quite striking. The rest of the world watching the United States, of all places, about whether we're stable, whether the US government is going to continue without any more chaos. They were watching the images in the same way we were, but with their own perspective. And then amid all this, you have agitation on Capitol Hill from the leader of the House of Representatives, a veteran foreign policy hand herself, Speaker Nancy Pelosi. So January 8th is a date that lives in infamy in our own notebooks for Peril, because it's a day of reaction, response, decision, 2 days after an insurrection.
Thank you. Let's just go back. I have a lot of questions moving forward, but seems like we can't just skip over January 6th. So the insurrection itself, you mentioned in your overview that it was planned out even more specifically than you maybe had anticipated. But how planned out was it? Did it play out the way it was supposed to, the way it was planned out to play out? And along with that, in the subsequent hours and the next 2 days, as Vice President Pence, right, has this, as he is agonizing about certifying a winner of this election in the wee hours of January 6th and the beginning of January 7th, it would have, he easily could have said he's unable to certify a winner. That's what President Trump was asking him to do, to say we have a competing slate of electors and he couldn't make a determination. So he could have punted to the House of Representatives, which would have triggered the constitutional crisis you referred to. How close did President Trump, what was he planning, and how close did he come to a successful coup?
Well, he was certainly pressuring Vice President Pence until the final hours. We have a scene in our book, January 5th, where the mob is gathering outside, but Pence, as vice president, is in the Oval Office, and he's telling President Trump, I can't do it constitutionally, I cannot do it. And he says, Mike, I made you. This is not verbatim, but it's to the effect of, Mike, you were nothing before I picked you as vice president, and you need to do this for me. And he points to the mob outside, Trump does, and says, if they want you to do this, if they say you have the power to do this, wouldn't you want to do it? It was the temptation of power laid out before a vice president of the United States, and he resisted. But what Trump was aiming for, as the Eastman memo shows and our reporting shows, is for lawmakers on Capitol Hill to do his bidding, Republicans, and to call the election of 2020 a fraud and to refuse to certify the election in the House and in the Senate. He was looking for a greater mass of Republicans to endorse that idea and to follow through with their own actions in refusing to certify Biden's victory. And as Steve Bannon puts it to Trump in the book, even if you don't win, it's about destabilizing the Biden presidency from the beginning. Bannon uses the phrase in a private conversation with Trump, kill the Biden presidency in the crib. It's a violent phrase, but it's the one Bannon used on December 30th, 2020 in a private phone call. And the point of that was they knew this was a long shot. This was a Hail Mary pass. Trump and Giuliani and his allies had failed in the courts in November and in December. And it was only in December that this new idea, the fixation on January 6th, came to the fore of the Trump presidency and his outside allies. And they were scrambling until the final moments to try to make something happen. What that something would be, some certainly were seeking a full overturn of the election, including Trump himself. He's acknowledged it. But others were seeking at the very minimum for Biden to be sullied from the beginning, at least in their eyes, to be have the country very much divided about whether he was a legitimate president. And that's part of why we're living in the times we are now, and why Woodward and I end our book with the phrase, peril remains, because the consequences of January 6th have not faded. The committee in the House of Representatives is issuing a flurry of subpoenas by the day, interviewing witnesses. I'm a little jealous of the lawmakers because as a reporter, all I have is a tape recorder, a pen, and a pad. They have subpoena documents, and they can get people to really talk. I try to do the same, but I don't have that power. And so we're going to always find out more about what's happening. And let's not forget, there are many ongoing investigations beyond the one on Capitol Hill, 2 ongoing grand juries in Georgia and Fulton County about President Trump's conduct after the 2020 election, ongoing civil financial investigation, a joint probe by the New York Attorney General, Letitia James, and the Manhattan District Attorney. And you also have a very quiet grand jury investigation at the Department of Justice, helmed by Merrick Garland. Very little news has come out of that DOJ grand jury, but we do know that grand jury has indicted Steve Bannon for refusing to comply with a congressional subpoena. So a lot of variables out there ahead of the midterm when it comes to President Trump's legal and political future.
A lot of variables. we're still have our election system. And where did all this leave the integrity of our election system? We read, polling shows today that strong majority of Republicans still say the election was stolen. Even though you report in Peril, we had Senators Graham and Lee saying there was zero evidence that the election was stolen. A majority of Republicans on the ground don't seem to believe this. So how concerned are you when you finished your analysis about the integrity of our election system, and what do you think needs to be changed in terms of voting laws, election process to ensure that January 6th doesn't occur next time?
Well, there's a wide array of activity I'm trying to track on these fronts. I'm glad you mentioned the part of the book on Senator Graham and Senator Lee, because in our book, we show that it's two very conservative senators, Graham and Lee, Republicans, allies of President Trump, who conclude that what Rudy Giuliani is pushing is not accurate. It's not based in reality, that they conclude the election was fair and that there's no evidence the election was riddled with fraud. And so it's Republicans privately, in scene by scene in our book, coming up to that conclusion, not two reporters just stating it. It's a conclusion that those two made with their own self-directed investigations of what Giuliani and Trump were giving to them in the final weeks of the administration about claims of fraud. They went through those claims and concluded they could not endorse the wholesale view that the election was a fraud. And when you look ahead to 2022 and 2024, there are many issues to cover. Democrats are particularly concerned by voting rights issues. Jim Clyburn, the congressman from South Carolina, very close to President Biden, and Speaker Pelosi, the House Majority Whip. There's a scene in our book where he's pressuring Joe Manchin, the West Virginia Democrat and senator, to endorse the Democratic package on voting rights. And Manchin has so far refused to do so because he does not want to break the filibuster to pass that voting rights package. But Clyburn goes at him again and again in a private meeting, and he says, Clyburn does, democracy is on fire. And when he says that, he's referencing many actions by state Republicans across the country to have greater oversight of elections and to tighten voting restrictions and voting rules in many states. And what you're seeing now is a real debate about voting rights and a debate about what I would say is election integrity and election counting. And they're related but separate issues. On Capitol Hill, there is an ongoing debate about reforming the Electoral Count Act. This is an ancient law that was revived in the national discourse during the January 6th period, when Congress was wondering, how does this certification actually work if the election is going to be contested? And there were many legal views being proffered about how to interpret the Electoral Count Act, not only by John Eastman, but by lawyers on Capitol Hill. And so what you now see is a discussion led by Manchin and Susan Collins, a bipartisan group, to come up with some kind of reform to this old law from that was pushed after the 1876 election. Is there going to be some reform to the Electoral Count Act in terms of understanding and with more clarity what Congress's role is in certification after the Electoral College votes? And then you're going to have a continued debate over voting rights. And a lot of this debate is being centered around redistricting, because 2020 was a census year and the pandemic has pushed a lot of the census discussion back. Redistricting is now only really coming to the center of the discussion in many states. And what you see in Alabama and Georgia and several other states, real concern about whether Black voters are being crowded out. In other words, are states that have, let's say, 2 majority Black districts and majority people of color districts now only going to have 1. And so voting rights activists are highly alarmed that redistricting is going to harm people of color. There's also real debate about access to voting in rural areas, lower income areas, to make sure that they have access to voting. And vote by mail is an issue Republicans are very critical of. The Trump wing of the Republican Party often blames vote by mail when they make these claims unfounded about fraud. And this is an issue that persists, and there's no real national cohesion on it.
Which I guess leads to a next question, even though I want to come back to President Biden. But, at this time globally, where we have our eyes on this balance between democracy and autocracy, what did you conclude in the context of your research and your book about the future of our democracy? How fragile is it? It's obviously all this election conversation is integral to this conversation too. But you reported, Donald Trump recently has stated that if he were reelected, he might pardon people involved in the January 6th insurrection. So what does all this mean for the future of our democracy? And also, it'd be great if you had any thoughts on what role we, as audience members, as citizens, can do to protect our democracy.
Well, I'm not a politician and I'm not an advocate, but I do believe when it comes to what people can do, having a civil conversation, having an in-depth discussion about these issues, it's very important. One of the things I find as a reporter when I travel around the country is too often people ask me, how do I get involved, whether they're right, left, or center? And I say, well, do you even talk to your neighbors? Do you talk to your family members, your spouse, your siblings about politics? Oh, no, but I want to do something. Well, the first thing you can do is try to listen, because this country is going through a churning political evolution, and the Democratic Party is convulsing. A person like Senator Bernie Sanders, whose ideas were on the political exterior for decades, now finds himself as a major voice. Someone like Donald Trump, who a decade ago was hosting a reality show on NBC broadcast channel, is now a former president who's holding rallies around the country and testing American democracy to the brink in the final days of his own presidency. So things change rapidly. Both parties have been changing in real and significant ways over the past 5 or 6 years. And so the first thing I try to do as a reporter, and perhaps you can do as a citizen, is listen, read, think. And I have 2 words that sit above my computer right here. Those 2 words are assume nothing. Assumptions can be critical in American political journalism. They can be critical and paralyzing in life. And let's not assume any of us know where this story is going, whether this country is going to veer left or veer right, veer towards autocracy or veer towards a more robust democracy. But we need to be attentive to it. I do know, having covered Trump for over a decade, that he is certainly on the march. This is not someone who holds political rallies by the week just for fun. This is someone who grew into the presidency when he was in it, arrived as a total outsider. I remember interviewing him in the early days of his presidency, still seeming to figure out how to drive the presidential car, shall we say, to understand the limits and scope of the US presidency. But by the end, this was someone who knew how to pull those levers of power. And he wants back in. As we report in our book, Brad Parscale, his former campaign manager, says Trump wants to run again, and if he runs again, it will be for vengeance. And so much of what's happening, when you listen closely to Trump's recent rallies, is he wants revenge, not on Biden, President Biden personally. You don't even really hear too much vitriol. You hear criticisms, some of it scathing, but not a lot of personal vitriol towards Biden. But the idea that his brand was one of defeat in 2020 for someone who has built his brand since the 1970s around gleaming skyscrapers and gold rooms and winning, he wants that luster to be back to his own political brand. So he's holding these rallies. And he is pressuring Republicans to echo him when it comes to the claims of fraud. And that's a real challenge for the Republican Party. Are they going to continue to echo him at every turn? And if someone pushes back, do they have political capital when they do so? It's one thing for someone to wag the finger at Trump or issue a statement against him or even give a speech against him. But will someone who has real power in the party do so? And so I'm keeping a close eye on Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, former Ambassador Nikki Haley, among others, to see how do they handle their own relationships with Trump and the Trump voter, but also their own relationships with truth.
Interesting. I wanted to, we have about 10 more minutes of my questions before I open this up to the audience, so I'll try to ask them concisely. Curious, you mentioned that we have this select committee now, this House Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack. And they recently got this trove of documents you referred to from the National Archives and Records Administration. Is there anything you're particularly hoping is in those documents that you weren't able to get a hold of?
Whenever I'm asked, what's the one thing I wish I could see? I say it's President Trump's phone logs from January 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th, 2021. Because if I've learned anything about covering Trump, it's that he uses the phone like no one else. When I went to visit him for the first time at Trump Tower in New York years ago, you go up to the 26th floor and it overlooks the Plaza Hotel in Central Park, and he has all this sports memorabilia, autographs from Tom Brady and quarterbacks and baseball players from Yankees past and other teams. The first thing you notice is that he does not use a computer. There's just a phone, a picture of his father, family, and he's on that phone all day. And he's someone who uses the phone late at night, calls people early in the morning, 5, 6 a.m. He's up early, he stays up late, watches TV to digest the news, makes phone calls about what he sees. And so if we're really trying to understand Trump's role at the very top in driving whatever happened on January 6th, we need to see the phone logs and connect and talk to the people who talk to him, because he's not someone who puts a lot of things on paper. And so those are the things I'm very curious about, whether the phone logs in detail of not only his presidential phone, but his personal cell phone are able to be found.
Thank you. You follow President Biden in his campaign in Peril, and all through his transition in his first months in office. And you show how he has these levers of power, but he's clearly struggling to navigate a deeply divided country. And President Trump, meanwhile, is stoking this division. So what surprised you about President Biden as a president, as you've watched him govern?
This is someone whose presidency changed when the Democrats won those 2 special elections in Georgia on January 5th. So January 6th was a turning point for Biden, not only with an insurrection, but the Democrats' wins in Georgia were made clear on January 6, 2021. And suddenly a president who expected divided government came in and had a Democratic majority, albeit a very narrow one. And his presidency changed in that period, January 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th. Even before he took the oath of office, he and Ron Klain, his incoming chief of staff, decided, along with other top advisors, our book shows this, to go big, to not kind of go in an incremental path when it comes to social spending policy, but to go very big. $1.9 trillion rescue plan. It was a bit of a struggle to pass, but not that hard. Our book shows that ultimately, with Manchin's help, they pass it in early March of 2021, and then they spend the rest of the year working on infrastructure. So on spending, this is a president who has spent trillions in his first year in office. It'll be interesting to watch whether voters give him credit and Democrats credit for the enormous level of spending, and whether they feel like it's working for them in the middle class. There's a belief inside the Biden White House that Biden will get credit for it. This is a president who responded in a big way to the pandemic and to infrastructure needs. This is also a presidency that's been challenged by foreign policy crisis with Afghanistan and the decision to withdraw. There's been criticism both on the reporting side and elsewhere, of course, from Republicans and some Democrats about Biden's withdrawal from Afghanistan. George Packer, the longtime writer for the New Yorker and now for the Atlantic, has a recent story up about Biden's decision that's creating some buzz in Washington. But you see a president who on one level is working arm in arm with Senator Bernie Sanders, his former primary race foe, going big on spending, having a transformational presidency when it comes to spending. That's a word that was circulating the White House in the early days of the Biden presidency. But more than a year in, he's facing headwinds. Donald Trump is still out there. The country politically is still very much divided. The Democratic Party has embraced Biden to a point, but there's also some concern that the party could be poised to lose seats in the upcoming midterm elections, and they would like to see something more from the White House. But so many allies of Biden have told me for the book and in recent weeks, well, what else can Biden do? He has spent so much money, been fully committed to helping people get projects. What else can he do? And a lot of the anger is because of inflation, polling shows, and gas prices. But Democrats still feel pretty good that they can try to kickstart things in the coming months.
I'm going to ask one final question before I open it up and see if there's audience questions, which I'm sure there are. You've probably been asked this before, but inquiring minds want to know. What was it like working with the greatest investigative reporter of all time and someone who's already authored 20 other books? I know you've called him your mentor, but what did you learn from him? And, maybe you would want to add, had you been writing this by yourself, is there anything you would have done differently? How are you guided in this by partnering with Bob Woodward?
Bob Woodward is a first-class individual. He and I interviewed Trump together before Trump was president. March 31st, 2016, we went to the Trump Hotel together. And the way that interview came together in early 2016, as Trump was moving toward the Republican nomination, was Woodward and I had ran into each other in the newsroom socially. And I started talking about my coverage of the Trump campaign. And I said to Woodward, Bob, Trump could win the nomination and Trump could win the White House. And Woodward said to me, you really believe that? I said, I do. I said, assume nothing. He has the grip of the party. He has a grip on the party. He has a grip on the voters. These crowds are unbelievable. Not that crowds are everything, but they reveal some level of enthusiasm. And Woodward turned to me, he said, if you believe that as a reporter, you need to ask Trump the governing questions. Ask him about how will he use power if he becomes president. Don't just ask him about the news of the day. And I turned to Woodward and I said, well, Bob, why don't you join me for that interview? So we emailed Hope Hicks and called up Trump and ultimately got time with him for over an hour. That interview transcript is still online. You can find it easily on the Washington Post website, the Woodward-Trump interview, March 31st, 2016. Fascinating to see how Trump perceived the presidency in history. And we were asking him those governing questions. And I've always respected Woodward, not only because of his excellence when it comes to authoring nonfiction political books, but because of his dedication to the craft of reporting. He is as old school as they come. Sit down with people for hours on end, knock on doors, record it all, get it transcribed, read your own transcript, read your own notes, think about it, go back, ask more questions, nail a story, nail a scene, nail verbatim dialogue, string it together, write the story. And, the secret of Bob Woodward is that, in a sense, there is no secret. It's hard work. And Woodward would prod me a lot to work harder, to think in more strategic ways about reporting. And Woodward's a brilliant interviewer. When you read his own transcripts, maybe one day those files will be available. When you read his transcripts, you're so struck by how he lets others talk. He's a listener. He wants to, as he once told me, let the silence suck the truth out of the room. Let it come out. Let the truth come out. And he taught me a little trick. Sometimes if you're getting the inclination to interrupt, take your pen, the back of the pen, not the pointed side, and just kind of nudge it in your thigh or your knee a little bit to remind yourself to shut up, listen, write. And one time Woodward was reading my transcripts, and he, in his very Midwestern way, turned to me and he said, "Bob, I really think you're doing a nice job with this. These are good." And then he turned a page and he saw Costa, colon, and about 5 paragraphs of text, then the source's name, colon, and about a sentence, then Costa, colon, 3 paragraphs of text, source, 2 sentences. And he looked at me and he said, "Bob, maybe it's best if you listen a little more." And that was Woodward's way of making a point in his very Wheaton, Illinois, Navy veteran way. Listen, do the job, let's get it done.
It's great advice. I'm writing it down. Let's open it up to questions, and I encourage members of the audience to please send in questions. Otherwise, I'll fill in with mine. Alicia Mignana has a question. What is your prediction with regards to any prosecution of Trump for the acts of January 6th?
I've already answered that a little bit. I think we got to pay attention to Georgia. We got to pay attention to the New York investigation of his finances. We don't really know what Merrick Garland's doing with his grand jury. In terms of prosecution, the January 6th committee appears, based on my own reporting for the book and conversations since, appears to be focused on doing a wide range of interviews, as wide as possible, to collect under oath testimony or details about Trump's activity in the final days, about what Jamie Raskin has called a conspiracy, the Democrat on the committee from Maryland. And what they're ultimately likely going to do is not only hold public hearings, but issue a report. In a way, it will remind some of the Mueller report or the 9/11 Commission report. It'll be a major statement, a book of sorts that's published probably later this summer, early fall at the latest, before the 2022 elections, a report summarizing all that they found. And that will be a document for history, because it will be so much that has been given to the committee under subpoena, under the threat of prosecution if they lie or perjure themselves. You cannot lie to Congress. So that will be a document that hopefully contains some new information, and it will be up to the committee and to decide whether they make a criminal recommendation to the Department of Justice. Congress can do that. They did so with the Steve Bannon subpoena. Congress can make a criminal recommendation from time to time. It's quite rare, but it can happen. So we'll see how that all plays out in the summer. But so much is going to depend on what new facts come to light and how Merrick Garland in particular decides to respond. And there will be some tricky constitutional issues, as we've already seen. Trump challenges almost everything that comes at him in the courts. In the role of a former president, and executive privilege could go all the way up to the Supreme Court. And Bannon and others like Mark Meadows appear to be waiting for the Supreme Court to make a decision on executive privilege in terms of their conversations with the president later this year.
Colleen Graffey, and I want to come back to the Supreme Court if no one else asks about it, but Colleen Graffey is asking, could you talk about the delay that took place before Trump finally spoke on camera to ask insurrectionists to leave the Capitol building? Is there any evidence that he refused or said that he liked what he saw on TV and didn't want it to stop? Is there any evidence that he was part of the reason for the delay in sending troops?
There was a delay in terms of the National Guard's arrival. That's still an area that needs more reporting on January 6th. We have scenes in our book of Congresswoman Alyssa Slotkin, a Democrat of Michigan, calling up Chairman Milley, pleading with him after the 3 o'clock hour on January 6th to get the Guard there. A lot of alarm on Capitol Hill that day that the Guard was slow. You had the leaders of the Congress go to a different site than many of the lawmakers. There was a disconnect in terms of communication with the military in the eyes of the senior leadership. You did have acting military leaders at that time, because Mark Esper, who had been Trump's defense secretary, was fired on November 9th, 2020. So you had an acting AG. Barr had resigned as AG in December. You had an acting Secretary of Defense. Mark Milley is the senior officer of the U.S. military, but he is not actually in the chain of command. The chain of command is the President, Secretary of Defense. And so it was a chaotic scene, to say the least. In terms of Trump's response, there's a scene in our book where Keith Kellogg, a retired lieutenant general, walks into the Oval Office to update Trump and tells him, you need to issue a tweet. Pence is safe, but this is really wild. You got to issue a tweet because people don't have televisions with them on Capitol Hill. They need to look at their phones. And he was someone who had firsthand knowledge of Trump on that day. He was around the Oval Office, inside the Oval Office. He's in our book as a character. He also recently testified before the January 6th committee. We're not entirely sure what he said. More reporting needs to come forward on that. We also know that Ivanka Trump, based on our reporting, went in to see her father and says, this has to end. Stop it. This has to end. She went in at least 2 to 3 times. And so that Trump was resisting advice for hours about reacting with indignation about the protest. In fact, he's watching it on TV, and by many accounts, not only our book, seemed to be quite pleased to see so many of his supporters fighting on his behalf.
Oren Aviv is asking, did Costa and Woodward share their sources with each other, or was there an invisible line where the authors kept their own sources to themselves?
We shared everything. You can't do a book where it's so sensitive on many fronts without having true trust and partnership. And so I'm deeply appreciative for Woodward having that trust in me. I have it in him to this day. There is no one better to work with in terms of sensitive material on national security, foreign policy, political stuff. But we were very careful. We tried our best to be as discreet as possible. Not easy at times, but we did our best. And in terms of sourcing, Woodward and I have discussed this publicly before. Sometimes you do interviews together. Sometimes you do them separately. If there's a certain kind of dynamic with a source, but you do share the material with your co-author, so everyone's on the same page as you are hunting and gathering material.
We have a question from someone at USC saying, if you could imagine writing a report in 2024 analyzing why Trump decided not to run, what is your guess? Not that you assume, but if you did, what is your guess about what you will say?
Well, I don't like to guess, but we have to watch in a real way Trump's standing in the Republican Party. Let me give you an example. And for 2024, if he chooses not to run, to answer the question, it might be because his standing has diminished in the Republican Party. I'm not saying that's going to happen, but you're asking if he doesn't run, why would that be? So how does his standing diminish, if ever? One thing I would urge you to track is his record in upcoming primary races. For example, in Alabama's open Republican Senate primary, a Trump-endorsed candidate, Congressman Mo Brooks, was the early favorite for the Republican nomination. He has Trump's endorsement. He spoke at the rally at the Ellipse near the White House on January 6th. He's as full-throated of a Trumper as you can get, though he did have some criticism actually of Trump years ago. He was a cruise guy during the 2016 campaign. Mo Brooks is running against a former chief of staff to the conservative, somewhat establishment current Senator Richard Shelby, who's retiring. Katie Britt is running against Mo Brooks. Katie Britt wasn't seen as a real contender until recent months, but now she's catching on in Alabama. She's seen as someone who has a lot of support in the business community. A lot of Trump people like her. She's not anti-Trump. And so if Mo Brooks loses in Alabama, what is the value of a Trump endorsement? It's very valuable, especially in red states, but maybe it's not everything. And so if it's not everything, then someone like DeSantis or Haley or whomever else decides to run may factor that into their decision, and Trump himself may factor it into their decision. So politics, just to answer the question in a winding way, is very fluid. And so we can't guess. We don't know the political climate or the economic climate. in 2022, 2023, 2024? Will there be some kind of conflict with China? I hope not. Or with Russia. None of us hopes for war, but we don't know. We don't know where the economy will go. Will the stock market, the Dow Jones Industrial Average, be at 40,000 or will it be at 15,000? These will be major reasons whether Trump runs or does not run. And sometimes they're out of Trump's hands.
Gwen Lurie Firestein, who you could assume is my sister, asks, as reporters, Trump must know that giving you and Woodward access to him would likely, oh, it just disappeared. Could we get that question back? I think the question was, Trump gave you and Woodward access. Did he assume it would be positive? Did he not, what was his motivation for giving you so much access to him?
Well, he actually didn't give us any access for this book. He did not participate in the book in any way. Neither did President Biden. In some ways, that almost frees you up as a reporter because sometimes presidential interviews can be very long and they're important to include if the president's willing to participate. But in this particular case, both presidents decided not to participate. I assume the question is more about Woodward's previous book, Rage, which came out in September of 2020. President Trump, after not participating in Woodward's 2018 book, Fear, he decided to participate in Woodward's second Trump book entitled Rage, and provided many on-the-record interviews to Bob Woodward. Some of those interviews were about the early days of the pandemic, which became global headlines when the book was published, about Trump's knowledge of the virus and how it works and its severity in early 2020. Those interviews rocked the world, shall we say. And so President Trump is someone who I have noticed throughout the years covering him often wants to participate in media interviews because he wants his side of the story to be included. But at times he's also angry, as we all know, with the media, and he chooses or refuses interview requests. You never really can tell where he's going to land as a reporter in terms of participation or declining. And that's just part of the wave you ride in this business.
Thank you. We have a question from an anonymous attendee. And the question is, terms like authoritarianism and fascism are often misused in public and political discourse. How do you approach covering objectively anti-democratic behavior by political groups when a lot of the terminology available has been co-opted by activist voices?
My view is cover everything in a vigorous way, get to the truth, remain nonpartisan, be tough, hold them all accountable on every side, but just show people what is happening. To me, to show where a country's really going, it's not about what a reporter like myself, I'm just a reporter. If I say something's authoritarian, some people may shrug, some may take it seriously, but that's me saying it. That's my opinion. But if I show you a 2-page, 6-part memo that says the President of the United States wants to throw out millions of votes that are counted by electors on the January 6th certification and have the election thrown to the House of Representatives, where the Republicans control a majority of the delegations and ultimately could throw the presidency to Donald Trump. That's a document memorialized in writing that we found. And you can make your own conclusions on that about where this country is heading and how close we came to the brink of a constitutional crisis. My word choice may be interesting to some of you. I know some of you love writing, and you would find it interesting when you read the book, how we describe some things and how we don't. But ultimately, how we write doesn't really matter. What we find and confirm is what matters to the citizen. And I just am a big believer, whether it's Democrats or Republicans, people deserve to know what's happening inside the room. And I would only urge people to have be not gentle, but be patient with reporters from time to time. Finding out big news, the real truth, often doesn't take a day. It takes weeks, if not months. And if the book taught me anything, it's that going back to people again and again, chipping away at a story, is sometimes much more effective than thinking you own a story for a day and moving on. And so I know people can get frustrated that reporters can take a long time, but look at these investigations on Capitol Hill. Very closed. What they're doing on Capitol Hill is very similar to what people do when they write a book. They talk to people, they hear one version of a story, another version of a story, maybe get a document here or there. And then when someone new comes into the room, they have a lot of material now to ask a new witness about. And they're really trying to piece together the chronology and understand what really happened. And sometimes the way to open up someone, whether it's a congressman asking a witness or whether it's a reporting asking a source, is to come at them with the best possible information. And when you come at someone with the best possible information, they will sit up straight and not just give you spin because they know you are an authority on the topic based on your reporting. And so when it comes to word choice, I agree. A lot of words today are highly charged. And I'm a big believer in trying not to be charged with the language I used or use to this day. But at the same time, I don't want to be neutral to the point of seeming meek. If I know something happened, I will state it calmly and authoritatively.
Thank you. We have about 4 minutes left. I'm going to ask you to do 2 things in that time. I want you to give any closing remarks you'd like to give. And maybe you could also, I'll mention that you have a new job at CBS News where you'll be covering the 2022 elections. And so maybe you could incorporate in your closing remarks the role you think the media should be playing, could best play in covering elections.
I'm looking forward to my new position at CBS News. I will be the chief election and campaign correspondent based in Washington, covering many of the issues we all discussed here tonight: democracy, elections, campaigns. Where does this all go? Where does this country go? What do voters want? What's happening on these investigations? Keep an eye on all of it. I'm honored to have had such a strong relationship with the Washington Post going back to 2014. A really wonderful experience there. Terrific people from the top down, Sally Busby, the editor, and they've been gracious as I take on this new adventure to allow me to continue to have a collaborative relationship from time to time on special projects and investigations. So I always hope to be a writer, whether it's on books or newspaper writing on the side, while also exploring new opportunities and challenges on television, because I do believe we're moving in a significant way towards visual storytelling being necessary, needs to be vital, needs to be good. Of course, CBS News and other networks are already doing A+ work, but I would like to try to be innovative and hard and driving hard to try to do things in a way that's compelling to people, to make people pay attention to the news and politics in a way that they just don't want to turn it off, but turn it on a little bit more. And so I think life's about sometimes testing yourself, and I'm going to test myself again, just like I did with the book, test myself at CBS News, and I'm looking forward to that opportunity. My closing remark would just be to all of you to keep supporting journalism. In California is such a major state. In the Valley, you're going to have some highly competitive congressional races. Gavin Newsom is clearly, after his win in 2021, in the recall, not even a rising, he's a major star, a major player in the Democratic Party. Could even be a future presidential contender. Of course, the Vice President of the United States, the possible next Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy, the current Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, all Californians. And so if you read your local news, you really get a sense that we're not just all national, even though California seems to be dominant nationally. I just think I've been to Fresno and San Francisco and LA many, many times, and they're just wonderful places. And support journalism, because the more we all read, the more we all talk, the stronger this country will be in terms of civil conversation and democratic conversation. And I just really appreciate the Pacific Council having me, Justin, Lou, and everyone for joining this conversation tonight. It's very generous of you to spend time on a Wednesday to listen to me all these months into my book tour. You're quite gracious. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Robert Costa. Support journalism. Thank you, Pacific Council. Support the Pacific Council. Thanks to all of you. Great questions, and our audience today. Thanks, Jerry Green and Mariah Nacionales Tafoya for coordinating all of this. Have a great evening, everybody.
Thank you.